But we do have this sort of tension between how we are perceived and how others want to see us. On the other hand, this kind of tension between impression and the perception of others can have even a life and death difference. A sort of also seemingly mundane example is your doorbell rings and it's someone who says, "Hi, I'm from the gas meter company and we need to check something, check the readings in your basement. Do you let this person in?" You know, most of the time this is a completely innocuous interaction. But a couple of years ago, I know in New York, in Queens, there were examples of people who were coming in to rob houses using the excuse that they were meter readers. So there you have a false impression where mistakenly believing it could have very dire consequences. In the world of most communication research, these issues around sort of impression making and assessing, and particularly that deception element of it, haven't been all that central. If you look at fields such as semiotics and linguistics, it really doesn't come into play at all. But in the one field where it's been very central is in the world of evolutionary biology. And there, among the world of animals, there's certainly very similar tensions. Here's an example. It's a quite interesting one. This is a gazelle, and it's doing something called stotting. And this is the reaction that Thompson's gazelles and some other forms of gazelles have when they see a predator. It turns out that the strongest of the gazelles do not do, and the fastest ones don't do what you expect them to do when they spot, say, a set of dogs that are predators to them coming. They don't run off as fast as possible. The fastest ones stay in place and jump up and down for quite a while. And what's interesting is most of the predators don't run after the ones that are doing that, even though you would think this is a rather tantalizing meal sitting here. The other gazelles are running away, and here's one that's just staying in place. And the way that biologists understand this now is that stotting is what's called a costly signal, which means that it is signaling that it is the strongest and the fastest, and it is doing that by wasting a resource that it has. And in this case, the resource is time. That if you are a slower gazelle, you don't have that time to be in one place. You have to take off and run. And it turns out that the predators do seem to understand this. And it looks like it's not something they're inborn learning, but they've learned it from experience. They don't go after the ones that are stotting. They know that once they get close enough, they will run off, and those are so fast they can escape. What's also interesting is that it's beneficial to all the gazelles because it also works very well as a alarm call. Now, if you're a slower gazelle, you can't afford to do that. And so something like that, where you can signal in a way that you have some resource by wasting it to show how much your abundance of it is one example of a form of communication that is inherently reliable. And so what I'm interested in doing is looking at how we can take this model of communication, which is effectively an economic model of what keeps communication honest enough to function, and apply it to a larger picture of human communication. And I'll give you a very quick introduction because I think we don't have time for a full, that's why I'm writing a book, a full introduction to the theory of signaling. But I'll give you some of the basics, and then we're going to look at some examples around the areas of ethics and technology. And so first, if we think about what is a signal, is that most of what people or animals want to know about each other are qualities that are not immediately apparent. In this case, it's how fast you are. It could be how kind you are, how smart you are, any kind of intention that you have. But we rely instead on perceivable signals of these otherwise hidden qualities. And signaling theory is interested in the relationship between the signal and the quality, in particular, why some signals are reliable indicators of others, whereas others may still be used, but they're less reliable. And basically, a signal is reliable if it can be given, if it's affordable to be given by someone who does it honestly, and unaffordable to those who don't actually have the quality. And then there are all kinds of other elements that go into this economics, because sometimes we use signals that are not, there's not such a strict, hard cutoff, and so some may be less reliable. They rely on the receivers to punish those who have been turned out not to be as honest as they would like them to be. Some of it just can be accepted because it may not be so bad to be deceived. While this theory has been used a lot in biology, it's starting to come into the world of psychology, etc. I think one interesting example is a researcher named Richard Sosis, who has looked into religious communities, particularly, especially Jewish communities, but a whole number of different religions. His work is in the evolution of religion. And he's interested in what is the value of costly signals. So one of the examples of what he looks at are things like, why do particular religious groups have what's called costly badges? So for instance, here's an example of a Orthodox community where people dress very differently than everyone around them. If you're in Israel on a swelteringly hot day and there's a number of people wearing fur hats around you, it's clearly some kind of costly signal of commitment to a particular way of identifying yourself. And he looks at what the value of how the particular costliness varies by the amount of trust within these different groups. He has a paper that's probably one of my favorite titles for a paper ever, and it's called "Why Are Jewish Synagogue Services So Long?" And his explanation of it, among other things, is that the length of the service seems very long if you are an outsider. If this is something if you're not learned in Jewish theology and you walk into a synagogue and it's a Saturday and it's 5 hours in Hebrew, much of it seemingly mumbled, it will be 5 hours in which you're sitting there fairly confused. Even if you understand the Hebrew, but you don't really know the material in depth, it would still feel like it's going on for a very long time. If, on the other hand, you have spent your life studying the minutiae of the Mishnah and the Torah, and you know every week's reading very well, and you know the slight differences in prayers that are said from one holiday to another, that 5 hours goes much faster because there's so much more of interest to you. And so one of his theories is that as a costly signal, that's one of the ways that it can differentiate, because the time spent is perceived very differently by those who are actually insiders and those who are not. And I think you can see similar examples outside of the world of religion. If you look at, say, avant-garde music performances, if you go to BAM or something, and there's 5 hours of fairly atonal music opera, if you have studied this and you really know this material and you're familiar with the story behind it and all kinds of pieces, it can make that 5 hours interesting to somebody who doesn't particularly like that, but say wants to appear that they are part of that particular subculture. It's a much costlier experience in terms of their perception of how the time is spent.